There is a moment in every empire's life when it discovers that the very foundation of its power has become its greatest vulnerability. For China, that moment arrived not with a bang, but with a bank transfer that never completed. In February 2022, when Western nations froze roughly $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves in response to the invasion of Ukraine, a chill swept through the financial corridors of Beijing that had nothing to do with winter. Chinese policymakers watched as assets held in dollars, euros, and pounds, reserves accumulated through decades of trade surpluses and carefully managed exchange rates, simply vanished from Russia's balance sheet with the stroke of a pen. The message was unmistakable. The same infrastructure that allows global commerce to flow smoothly, the banking networks that settle transactions in microseconds, the reserve currencies that facilitate international trade, could be weaponized. And if it could happen to Russia, it could happen to China. This realization has set in motion one of the most consequential but least understood financial transformations of our time. China is not preparing for a trade war or a military confrontation. It is preparing for something far more complex and dangerous, a capital war, a conflict fought not with tariffs or aircraft carriers, but with the architecture of money itself. To understand why this matters, you need to understand the trap China finds itself in, a trap so elegant in its construction that it resembles a financial suicide pact. China holds approximately $3.3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves as of late 2025, making it the largest holder of foreign currency in the world. Japan, the second largest holder, possesses about $1.2 trillion. Switzerland sits at around $800 billion. China's reserves are not just large, they are unprecedented in human history. No nation has ever accumulated this quantity of another country's currency. Roughly half of these reserves, perhaps more, are denominated in US dollars. They sit in US Treasury bonds, in agency debt, in dollar-denominated assets scattered across the global financial system. On paper, this looks like strength. In reality, it is a hostage situation. China needs these reserves because of how its economy is structured. The renminbi is not a freely floating currency. It is managed, controlled, pegged within a narrow band against the dollar. To maintain this peg, to prevent the renminbi from appreciating too rapidly or depreciating too sharply, China's central bank must constantly intervene in foreign exchange markets. When dollars flood into China from trade surpluses or foreign investment, the People's Bank of China must buy those dollars and sell renminbi to prevent the currency from strengthening too much. This is how the reserves accumulated in the first place. But here is the trap. These reserves are not truly China's to use freely. They cannot be deployed for domestic purposes. They cannot build infrastructure inside China or fund social programs. They exist in a strange limbo, parked in assets denominated in the currency of a geopolitical rival, accessible only through financial systems that rival controls. Chinese economist Yu Yongding has called this a grotesque misallocation of resources. For nearly 2 decades, China's real net investment income from these reserves has been negative. Think about that. China lends money to the United States by buying treasury bonds at minimal interest rates, while foreign companies invest in China and extract much higher returns. The wealth flows in the wrong direction. And yet China cannot simply sell these reserves without triggering chaos. A mass sell-off of dollars would cause the renminbi to appreciate sharply, making Chinese exports uncompetitive overnight, triggering unemployment, destabilizing the very export economy that built modern China. Moreover, a fire sale of U.S. treasuries would crater the bond market, destroying the value of the remaining holdings. China would lose money on every transaction. It would be financial self-immolation. This is what strategists call a dollar trap, and it is not an accident. It is a feature of the post-Bretton Woods international monetary system, a system designed when the United States was the undisputed hegemon and the dollar was as good as gold. In that system, countries that run trade surpluses with the United States accumulate dollars. They then reinvest those dollars in U.S. assets, effectively lending the money back to America at low interest rates. This allows the United States to run persistent trade deficits and government budget deficits without the usual economic consequences. Other countries finance American consumption and American wars. It is an exorbitant privilege, as a French finance minister once bitterly observed. But it is also a prison for surplus countries like China, and that prison has become increasingly uncomfortable. In the years since the Russian reserves were frozen, Chinese policymakers have watched as the United States has expanded the use of financial sanctions as a foreign policy tool. Sanctions no longer target only rogue regimes and terrorist organizations. They have become a routine instrument for punishing adversaries, pressuring allies, enforcing compliance with American foreign policy preferences. Iranian banks are cut off from the global financial system. Venezuelan assets are seized. Russian oligarchs see their wealth frozen across multiple jurisdictions. The pattern is clear. If you are on the wrong side of Washington, your money is not safe, no matter where it is, as long as it is in dollars. Chinese officials do not speak about this publicly with the bluntness it deserves, but in policy journals and academic conferences, the anxiety is palpable. One study published in a state-backed think tank in 2024 warned explicitly that China's official dollar assets are increasingly at risk of becoming hostages. The reference to Russia was unmistakable. Another prominent economist argued that China should reduce its holdings of U.S. government debt precisely because of the growing sanctions risk. This is not paranoia. This is rational risk assessment. And it has led China to pursue what is perhaps the most ambitious financial project of the 21st century: the quiet, systematic effort to build an alternative to the dollar-dominated global financial system. But here is where the story becomes strange, because China's response to the dollar trap is not what you would expect. It is not a dramatic decoupling, not a sudden dumping of dollars, not the launch of a rival global currency to replace the greenback. Those ideas make for exciting headlines, but they misunderstand both the nature of the problem and the Chinese approach to solving it. What China is actually doing is far more subtle, far more patient, and in the long run, potentially far more disruptive. It is building parallel infrastructure, creating redundant systems, cultivating alternative pathways for money to flow, not to replace the dollar immediately, but to ensure that when and if the day comes that China is cut off from dollar networks, the Chinese economy does not collapse. Think of it as financial prepping, the geopolitical equivalent of stockpiling food and fuel in case of emergency. The most visible piece of this infrastructure is the cross-border interbank payment system, known as CIPS, which China launched in 2015. On the surface, CIPS is simply a payments network that facilitates transactions in renminbi. It allows banks around the world to send and receive payments in China's currency without routing those transactions through the dollar system. As of early 2025, CIPS connects nearly 1,500 indirect participants across 119 countries, linking close to 5,000 banks in 185 nations. These are not trivial numbers. But CIPS is not yet a rival to SWIFT. the Brussels-based messaging network that handles most international bank transfers. SWIFT moves tens of millions of messages per day. CIPS is orders of magnitude smaller. What matters is not the current scale, but the direction of travel and the strategic intent. CIPS exists so that if China is ever cut off from SWIFT, as Russia partially was, trade can continue. Renminbi can move. The economy can breathe. This is not about dominance. This is about survival. The same logic applies to currency swap lines, those boring technical arrangements between central banks that allow them to exchange currencies without going through the dollar. China has signed swap agreements with dozens of countries, from Argentina to the United Arab Emirates, creating a web of bilateral arrangements that can facilitate trade in yuan and local currencies during times of stress. When Argentina needed to pay its debt to the International Monetary Fund in 2024 and lacked sufficient dollars, it tapped its swap line with China. The payment went through. The system worked. Again, this is not about replacing the dollar for everyday transactions. It is about creating a backup plan. Then there is the push to settle trade in renminbi rather than dollars, especially with countries that have their own reasons to reduce dollar dependence. Russia now conducts most of its trade with China in yuan and rubles. Brazil signed an agreement to settle trade in yuan. Saudi Arabia has explored pricing oil in renminbi. These shifts are incremental, often symbolic, but they add up. As of 2024, the renminbi is used in roughly 50% of intra-BRICS trade, a dramatic increase from just a decade ago. In global terms, the yuan still accounts for less than 5% of foreign exchange reserves, a fraction of the dollar's nearly 60% share. But 5% is not zero. It is a foothold. And foothold LDS matter when you are trying to climb out of a trap. What makes this strategy particularly clever is that China is not asking the world to trust the renminbi the way it trusts the dollar. It is not trying to convince central banks to hold vast reserves of yuan or to price global commodities in Chinese currency. That would require a level of financial openness, a liberalization of capital controls that Beijing is unwilling to accept. China learned the lesson of the 1997 Asian financial crisis. Countries that opened their capital accounts too quickly, that allowed money to flow freely in and out, were vulnerable to devastating speculative attacks. Thailand, South Korea, Indonesia, all were brought to their knees by capital flight. China has no intention of repeating that experience. So instead of full liberalization, China is pursuing what scholars call managed internationalization. The renminbi is being allowed to circulate more freely abroad, in offshore markets like Hong Kong, Singapore, and London, while the onshore market in mainland China remains tightly controlled. You can use yuan for trade settlement. You can hold yuan bonds. You can even invest in certain Chinese assets. But you cannot freely convert large sums of yuan into dollars and move them out of China whenever you please. Capital controls remain in place, and they are enforced with increasing sophistication. This hybrid model creates an odd situation. The renminbi is both international and not international. It is widely used in certain contexts, particularly trade finance, but it lacks the full convertibility that would make it a true rival to the dollar. And that is precisely the point. China wants the flexibility to settle trade in its own currency, reducing its need for dollar reserves and its exposure to sanctions, but it does not want to give up the control over capital flows that has been central to its economic stability. This approach has worked to a degree. The renminbi's share of global trade finance has roughly doubled since the start of the Ukraine war, a direct consequence of China's intensified push and other countries' growing wariness of dollar dependence. But it has also revealed significant limitations. The biggest problem is liquidity. If India wants to buy Russian oil in rupees, and Russia wants to use those rupees to buy goods from India, everything works smoothly. But if Russia ends up with a large surplus of rupees and cannot find enough Indian goods it wants to buy, those rupees just pile up in Russian bank accounts, essentially useless. This is not a hypothetical problem. It is happening right now. Russian banks are sitting on enormous quantities of Indian rupees because the trade flows are imbalanced. The same issue arises with the renminbi. Countries that do not run trade surpluses with China do not earn enough yuan to pay for their imports from China. They need a way to acquire renminbi, and that requires either borrowing yuan, earning yuan through other transactions, or exchanging dollars for yuan. All of these options ultimately loop back into the dollar system in one way or another. This is why some Chinese economists have floated more radical ideas, like linking renminbi oil sales to gold futures, creating a petroyuan that could be converted into gold rather than dollars. The idea went nowhere. China does not have enough gold market liquidity to support such a system, and the idea of tying the currency to gold in an era of fiat money seemed absurdly retrograde. The petroyuan, despite occasional headlines, remains more concept than reality. And yet, even with these limitations, the infrastructure is being built. The networks are expanding. The pathways are being tested. And this is where the true strategic logic reveals itself. China is not preparing to fight a capital war today. It is preparing for a capital war that may come years or even decades from now, a conflict that might be triggered by a crisis over Taiwan, by a broader breakdown in U.S.-China relations, by some unforeseen geopolitical shock. In that scenario, the United States would almost certainly attempt to freeze Chinese dollar reserves, just as it froze Russian reserves. Chinese banks would be cut off from SWIFT, dollar transactions would halt. And in that moment, all the infrastructure China is building now, the payment systems, the currency swaps, the trade settlement agreements, would become not optional but essential. The question is whether it would be enough. Could China's economy function without access to the dollar system, even temporarily? The honest answer is that no one knows, because such a scenario has never occurred. The global economy is so interconnected, so dependent on dollar-denominated trade and finance, that cutting off the world's second-largest economy would be an act of mutual destruction. It would not just hurt China. It would devastate global supply chains, trigger a financial crisis, crash markets worldwide. It would be the economic equivalent of a nuclear exchange. Both sides would lose. But that is precisely why China is preparing. It is not preparing to win such a conflict. It is preparing to survive it. And survival, in this context, means ensuring that if the dollar trap snaps shut, China has an escape hatch. There is another dimension to this story that often gets overlooked in the technical discussions of payment systems and reserve currencies, and that is the sheer scale of the wealth at stake. Those $3 trillion in reserves are not just numbers on a central bank balance sheet. They represent decades of labor, of factories built, of goods exported, of savings accumulated. They are the product of hundreds of millions of Chinese workers who accepted low wages, poor conditions, environmental degradation, all in the name of national development. That wealth was supposed to lift China into the ranks of developed nations. Instead, it is held hostage in the currency of a rival power. This creates a profound sense of injustice within Chinese policy circles, a feeling that the international financial system is rigged against them. and they are not entirely wrong. The dollar's dominance was not an accident of market forces. It was a product of geopolitical power, of decisions made at Bretton Woods in 1944 when the United States was the only major economy not devastated by World War II. It was reinforced during the Cold War, when the dollar became the currency of the Western Alliance. And it has been maintained through a combination of economic strength, military power, and institutional inertia. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the global financial architecture all were designed by and for the dollar system. China's challenge is that you cannot simply opt out of this system without paying an enormous price. The dollar's dominance is not just about American power. It is about network effects, about the fact that the dollar is liquid, widely accepted, backed by deep financial markets and the rule of law. Even countries that dislike American foreign policy use dollars because everyone else uses dollars. It is a self-reinforcing equilibrium. Breaking that equilibrium requires not just building alternative infrastructure, but convincing enough other countries to use that infrastructure to make it viable. And this is where China's broader geopolitical strategy intersects with its financial strategy. The push for renminbi internationalization is not separate from the Belt and Road Initiative, from China's efforts to build influence in the global south, from the expansion of BRICS. These are all pieces of the same puzzle. China is trying to create a coalition of countries that have a shared interest in reducing dollar dependence, either because they face sanctions risk themselves, or because they resent American financial hegemony, or simply because they see an opportunity to diversify their economic relationships. This coalition does not need to replace the dollar to succeed. It just needs to be large enough and integrated enough to provide China with options. If a significant portion of China's trade can be settled in renminbi or local currencies, if enough countries are connected to CIPS, if swap lines and bilateral agreements create sufficient liquidity, then China is no longer entirely dependent on the dollar system. It has alternatives. And having alternatives changes the strategic calculus. It means that the threat of financial sanctions becomes less absolute, less existential. It does not eliminate the threat, but it reduces it to something manageable. The question that haunts all of this, the question that Chinese policymakers must ask themselves every day, is whether they are moving fast enough. The infrastructure they are building takes time. Trust takes time. Network effects take time. But geopolitical crises do not wait. If a confrontation over Taiwan erupts tomorrow, if sanctions are imposed next year, will the alternative systems be ready? Will they work under stress? Or will they collapse like a house of cards, revealing that the escape hatch was always illusory? There is reason for skepticism. Many of the agreements China has signed are more symbolic than substantive. BRICS, despite its expansive rhetoric about a new financial order, remains a loose coalition with divergent interests. India is deeply wary of anything that looks like Chinese dominance. Russia is focused on its own survival. Brazil is cautious about antagonizing the United States. The idea of a unified BRICS currency, which circulates periodically in the media, has been effectively abandoned. Putin himself stated publicly in late 2024 that it is too early to talk about such a thing, a polite way of saying it is not going to happen. What this means is that China is largely on its own. It can build infrastructure, it can sign agreements, it can push for greater use of the renminbi, but it cannot force other countries to abandon the dollar. It cannot create a rival to the dollar's network effects through policy alone. It can only create conditions in which alternatives become possible, and then wait for circumstances, crises, conflicts, to push countries toward those alternatives. And this brings us to the deeper truth about the dollar trap. It is not just a financial problem. It is a geopolitical problem rooted in the structure of global power. As long as the United States remains the dominant military power, as long as American markets remain the largest and most open, as long as the rule of law in the United States is perceived as more reliable than in China, the dollar will retain its primacy. No payment system, no currency swap, no trade agreement can overcome that underlying reality. What China is betting on, implicitly, is that this reality is changing. It is betting that American power is in relative decline, that the reliability of American institutions is being questioned, that the weaponization of the dollar will accelerate its own obsolescence. It is betting that other countries, watching what happened to Russia, will conclude that holding too many dollars is dangerous and will quietly diversify. It is betting, in other words, on the slow erosion of American hegemony. This is a very long game. It may take decades to play out, and it may never result in the renminbi replacing the dollar as the global reserve currency. That was never the realistic goal. The goal is something more modest and perhaps more achievable, a multipolar monetary system in which the dollar coexists with the euro, the renminbi, and perhaps a patchwork of regional currencies and payment systems. In such a world, China would not dominate, but it would no longer be trapped. It would have options. And options are what China is buying with every swap line, every CIPS transaction, every renminbi trade settlement. What makes this story so compelling, so tragic in a way, is that both sides are trapped. China cannot escape the dollar system without enormous cost and risk. The United States cannot maintain the dollar's primacy indefinitely without the very actions, sanctions, weaponization that accelerate the search for alternatives. Each side's rational response to its own security concerns pushes the system toward fragmentation. We are not moving toward a single global financial system with the dollar at its center. We are moving toward a bifurcated world, a world where different blocs use different currencies and different payment systems, where cross-border transactions require navigating an increasingly complex web of bilateral agreements and currency exchanges. This is less efficient. It is more expensive. It increases transaction costs and reduces the benefits of globalization. But it may be unavoidable. The logic of geopolitical competition is pulling the financial architecture apart.